Okay, so we are live. Welcome to those who have joined us on Zoom, and welcome to those who are watching this on Facebook. So we are here tonight to talk about presenting testimony in a legislative hearing. So yeah, before we get started, just gonna give you, introduce our presenters today. So we have Adriano, myself, and Allison. And so I'm actually gonna pass it off to both of you to introduce yourselves. So I'll start with Adriano.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Adriano Udani. I am an associate professor of political science at the University of Missouri St. Louis in the Department of Political Science. I also direct the Public Policy Administration program and also serve as the research advisor for the Community Innovation and Action Center. Thank you very much for having me.
And my name's Allison Riley. I am the Missouri Area Coordinator for Amnesty International USA, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Thank you both. And I am, again, Alicia Hernandez. My gender pronouns are she, her. I am the Eastern Missouri organizer at the ACLU of Missouri. And so if you're in the Zoom room, if you can please also introduce yourself in the chat, give us your name, your gender pronouns, and one reason why you have or have not given public testimony. Yeah, regardless if you have or haven't, we want to know what moved you to do it, or if you haven't, what has kept you from giving testimony. And so with that, I am actually going to pass it off to Allison to talk to us about why presenting testimony is important.
Yes, thank you. So what is testimony? Why is it important? Why do we need it? Why do we need to do it? So just so everyone is aware and we have the same definition, when bills are proposed in the legislature, there's an opportunity for members of the public to speak for or against the legislation. That those opinions is the testimony that we are going to be talking about today. And it can be both written or in person, voice testimony, and elements of both will come into play during today's training. So why is having this testimony so important? So the main reason is because it gives community members a place and time to advocate for these policies and to do it directly with the representatives and the government who is ultimately making these decisions. It's very important for our senators and representatives to hear how laws directly could impact voters and the community and anyone who will be affected by the legislation. So doing this testimony is not only good for persuasion, moving government officials from one side to the other, possibly moving voters or other stakeholders from one side to the other on legislation, but it's also important for public record. An example for this is the spy planes issue that was most recently here in St. Louis. It can seem that there's some members on the Board of Aldermen who are going to lean one way or the other no matter what. So why do they need to hear from their constituents? If they're a solid yes on this issue, why does it matter that people say no? A big reason for that is for the public record. If there is a supporter who is supporting this legislation and their constituents are testifying against, that's very important to not only record and be able to show, but that could also be used for an opponent who decides to run against them and can say, they supported this when their constituents did not. They're clearly not in touch with their constituents, while someone like me can be more in touch and can actually advocate for what you want to advocate for. So it's an example of just how important testimony can be. Moving on to the next slide. So who can testify? It can kind of seem that especially if you've been to a lot of hearings or seen a lot of these sessions, that you have to be an executive director of an organization or personally impacted or a subject matter expert to testify. And although all of those things are great, and if you are any or all of those things, you should definitely testify when you have the chance. But also really anyone can testify. If you are a community member, if you are a, a resident of a city, if the government body making these decisions, represents you and this legislation will impact you in some way, it's important for you to testify as well. Your testimony can provide an interesting perspective and lens to this issue that might not be thought of. And also it shows that like the community cares and that this legislation is important to the community, to the general public, and that politicians should keep that at the top of their mind when they talk about these issues. And so really anyone who cares, has an opinion, should testify if they are able. And that's all I have. So I will move it and pass it on to Adriano.
Great. Thanks, Allison. So, understanding testimony is important to understand just sort of the context in which it takes place. And so the state legislative process is quite complex, difficult to understand. It's also difficult to teach as a political scientist, since there's so many windows of opportunity and channels to influence the legislators. Added to this, we have 50 different state legislatures that vary in their own respective composition, including party, occupational background, whether they're full-time or part-time legislatures. And then there's the members in terms of their race, class, gender, age, and ability. But what I think we do know is that the state legislative process has a similar path, regardless of what state you're in. And so here's a useful graph provided by the National Council of State Legislatures that identifies some key points. And so there are three things that I want to draw your attention to. Just as a preview, I'm going to be saying if a lot, so I apologize if it gets too annoying. But so with the exception of Nebraska, that only has one legislative chamber, all other state governments have two chambers, the House and the Senate. A bill can be introduced in either the Senate or House, except appropriation bills, which by tradition originate in the House. So the first chamber can decide to convene committee hearings on a bill. And if it makes it through committee, the bill will be considered by all members of the chamber of origin. And so if the bill is approved by that first chamber, it is then sent to the second chamber where it follows a similar procedure. So now my second point, the second chamber can just on its face approve the bill as is and can send it to the governor. However, if there are changes in the bill, it is sent back to the chamber of origin for approval or further consideration. And so once the bill makes it to the governor's desk, he or she will have the choice to sign it into law or veto it. If the bill is vetoed, it goes back to the chamber of origin where it requires 2/3 of the chamber to override a veto. It then moves to a second chamber where again, it requires 2/3 of the chamber to override. And so currently the Missouri legislature is considered veto proof since around 70%, I think, of the Senate, 70% of the House are in the same political party, the Republican Party of Governor Parsons. So you might have heard me saying if a lot in this overview of the legislative process. And those ifs are important because where a bill ends up really depends in large part, on voters. And so my last point here draws attention to just the various ways that people can get involved. And so to contact legislators, the blue dots indicate that you can write letters, you can write emails, make phone calls, take to social media during floor debates or when a bill is on the governor's desk or is about to arrive at the governor's desk. Obviously, the pandemic has made it more difficult to have town halls and to face-to-face meetings, but we've tried to be more creative there. And then other ways to participate is by helping formulate an idea for a legislative bill or participate in a legislative committee hearing, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. So what to expect in a committee hearing? So what happens is that the committee chair will open the hearing and will call out the bill by number. And so this is something that you'll want to sort of keep in mind. And then the opening statements will be made by the bill's main sponsor, and committee members in the committee will be asked to ask questions of the sponsor. And so this part can take some time. Typically, it is, they stack the deck in tossing softballs if the committee is controlled by the controlling party and that the bill sponsor is the same member of the political party. But if they are in opposite parties, that's when the questions could get a little contentious and also and drawn out. But regardless, the chair will then ask for testimony from proponents and then also opponents. And so this is where testimonials come into place. And so there might be a wait here, especially if the bill that you're participating in tends to spark up debate. And so it's important to just sort of listen to cues and also tracking where the testimony is, as well as the people that testify before you, in the sense that it's useful to sort of understand other contexts and information that different people and different organizations are bringing to light on the latest information on legislation. So how do you actually write a statement? And so we wanted to provide some general guidelines in providing a good oral testimony. And so here are some things to think about. The first is to address the committee chairperson and committee members, right? Stating your name, where you live, and the organization that you're representing. Obviously trying to be as respectful as possible, even though you're there to, stop a bill that you find inhumane or doesn't treat people with dignity. You still want to, respect the chamber in which you are called to testify. But you want to make sure that you clearly state whether you support or oppose the bill, and to be sure that you identify the bill by its number as well as the author. The other thing that I wanted to also point out is that, as Allison was talking about, we tend to think about this, silver screen rendition of testimony during legislative hearings, where there's lots of policy jargon and grandiose statements. In many ways, the most effective testimony, in my humble opinion, is summarizing your reasons for your position concisely and keeping it simple as well as genuine. And I think that personal stories are very important in the sense that stories communicate and resonate with people more so than statistics. And I teach a statistics class. And I think that your ability to connect stories to why it's important and why these issues affect the entire community, not just yourself, will really help to communicate why this matters for a public and not just individuals. It's often good to restate your position before you end and thank the committee for their time. And then also before or after testifying, we also would suggest to fill out and submit a witness form that will be given to you at the hearing, just so that there's evidence that and a trail for others to understand and keep track of you being there.
And so I'm going to talk a little bit about your tone and terminology when you are presenting your testimony, giving you all some best practices and a little bit of advice. So yeah, like this slide says, you are advocating for an issue that you are absolutely passionate about one way or another. And it is important to communicate that to everyone in the room. So as Adriano walked us through, preparing your testimony in advance is crucial. There are also some other things, making sure that you project your voice. Sometimes there is a mic, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes the mic doesn't work. So you will have to speak loudly, speak clearly, try to keep an even tone and an even pace. Try to use simple and direct language. When you can, make eye contact with the committee. Absolutely. So when I talk to people about giving testimony, one of the things I hear is that the most common reason for not giving testimony is actually nervousness. And that makes absolute sense. But don't underestimate the power of your voice. So just want to let you know that committee members are accustomed to hearing all types of speakers. Nervous speakers, as Allison mentioned earlier, maybe some representatives of organizations who maybe have experience in this, but also community members. There are a lot of community members who show up to testify, and people who show up to testify have a wide range of experience and comfortability with it. So if you are nervous, please know that you are not alone when you are in that committee room to present testimony. So another thing I just want to point out is that, and I think we've said this already, public hearings are one of the most important processes to the legislative process itself. It is that point in time when our legislators get to hear from their actual constituents and people that they are representing about this bill and this issue. So one way that I like to sort of get people out of that nervousness is to really think about forgetting about yourself. This is not about me. This is about us. This is about we. This is about your message. The more you concentrate on your message, write it down, edit it, practice it, the less nervous you'll be. If there is a sentence or a statement in your testimony that keeps tripping you up, change it up a bit. Like this item says, use simple and direct language. We don't have to throw out big vocabulary words. Really what is important is that your values and your stance on this issue and why it's important to you comes out. But do keep in mind that it should be clear and consistent, and most importantly, within time. So whenever there is a hearing notice for a specific bill, oftentimes there is also a time limit with that notice. It can be 5 minutes, sometimes it's 3 minutes. Also, if the committee chair sees that there are a lot of people there to present testimony, they may decide in that moment to cut it. So they may say, you know what, I gave you all 3 minutes, but we're actually going to pivot to 2 minutes. So it is important that you can address this issue within the allotted time. And there are timekeepers in the hearing. So if you do run long, don't be surprised that you may be cut off, or you may be given a time check or asked to wrap up your thoughts. As I mentioned, practice, practice, practice. It is always important to be comfortable and confident in what you are going to say to the committee. So making sure that you have written down your words in advance and have really thought through them. And I even now, and I've given testimony quite a bit, I still put my thoughts down, read it out loud. I time myself. If there are sentences that are tripping me up, I try to find a way to rework them or continue to practice them until I feel comfortable with what I am saying. Yeah, and so after you give your testimony, your 2 to 3 minutes of your statement, there's a chance that the committee then might ask you some questions. And so we just want to make sure that we prepare you for all possible parts of testimony. So as this slide says here, a committee member may ask you a question about your position, or they may ask you to expand on your story. If you have an answer, you can share. And so take a deep breath, think about your response. You don't have to shoot off a response immediately. You can give yourself a minute to think about it. thank the committee member for their question, and then answer honestly and concisely. If you don't feel comfortable responding to the question, or you think that you don't have the answer, don't worry and just be honest. That is not a problem at all. As this slide says, you can take a deep breath, express that you're unsure or that you do not know the answer to their question. And if you feel inclined, you can reframe the conversation with your testimony. I'm not sure about that, but what I know is. So for example, one type of rebuttal, which is in the form of a question that we get when we testify on issues that affect immigrants and migrants, is this really loaded question. I'm trying to think of how it's been phrased before, essentially equating immigration and undocumented people to criminals. Why do you think that if someone is breaking the law, they shouldn't be arrested or detained? That is very loaded and unfair, and it can catch people off, it can catch people off guard. We have seen it happen in committee hearings before. And that is an opportunity when you can say, you know what I do know is that, and give your response, again, sort of framing it in your values and how you see this issue. And you don't have to answer questions. You don't have to expand if you're asked. But again, if you feel confident and comfortable, you may do so. And that's it for me. With that, I will pass it off to Adriano to talk about written testimony.
Thanks, Alicia. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about written testimony, to contact your legislator or legislators, and then what to do and some strategies after the testimony. So when we're thinking about written testimony, here's some things to consider. One is, who you are and where you're from and who you're affiliated with really matters in terms of the connection that you're making between the legislation that is being considered and also how that is going to impact your constituency or your community. And so that's really the power of these written testimony that you can communicate to your legislator. And also, it doesn't necessarily have to be to your legislator. It could be to another legislator that you're trying to influence in trying to understand why, to try to bust myths about immigrants, for example, or asylum seekers. In the written testimony that I provide, I'm often not talking to my legislator. I'm trying to convince another legislator who has been poorly informed about migrant communities as well as the impact of immigration enforcement in the United States. And in those letters, I try to describe how this actually affects everyday lives, not necessarily among migrants, immigrants and migrant communities. I mean, not to say that that's not important, but what I'm trying to convince that legislator is how this actually affects voters and how this sort of can tip favor and also rile up opposition, depending on how he, she, they align themselves with legislation. So personal connections, personal stories matter here. In this day and age of just form letters, it's getting very easy to just attach your name to a form letter or a cookie cutter letter. And oftentimes those letters are sort of thrown out just because they say the same thing, they have the same format, it's just churned into this machine that spits out a lot of letters, but they're saying the same thing. And so not to say that you should avoid those. I think that they're extremely helpful, and it definitely makes the letter writing very efficient. But it's important to sort of add personal details when possible, right? Not downplaying the connections that you have to your neighbors, to organizations that you work with, either through just affiliation, or even in your own jobs. Like those matter. And I think oftentimes we take those for granted. Lastly, just sending these through just regular mail, email, or even fax, for those who still use fax. Those are all accepted, and they all are useful in terms of their impact, in my opinion. So let me talk about how to amplify your testimony. So you write a letter to your legislator, you participated in testimony, or you write up your testimony, you submit it to a legislator, your own legislator. I wanted to provide some tips on how you can actually amplify your testimony when you return home, and or you want to make smaller, more consistent moves in making sure that your voice is heard by public discourse or in public discourse. Oh, can you go back, Alicia? Sorry. So there's three things that I wanted to mention. When you write your testimony and you consider some venues such as op-eds, there's three things that you should keep in mind: audience, the structure of your argument, as well as your writing. So what you're looking for in particular op-eds is that you want to aim for what's going to grab and hold a person's attention of that person who's scanning their phone, right? That's who you're trying to capture that's who you're trying to appeal to, is to try to figure out a way that you're going to make that person that's distracted by many types of media, what's that one person going to pay attention to your particular story. You also have to consider, what makes sense to someone who knows nothing about the issue. And this is something that's really challenging for me as an academic, to understand how do I step out of my own realm of my own language and break it down to make it achieve an accessible enough language that communicates and resonates to an entire community, as well as describing why that problem is relevant for the entire community and not just one particular sector of the public. The structure of your testimony, as you translate it into an op-ed or a letter that you share publicly, really matters. Titles matter, right? Titles are catchy. I'm terrible at titles, and I think creativity counts in trying to capture that excitement and that attention. But what I like to tell my students and others in writing op-eds is to think about this. Your overarching argument is that sort of singular sentence. But then when you think about that singular argument, overarching argument, you want to just create at least three main supporting sentences that support or are related to your overarching argument. Those three sentences will turn into the main body of your op-ed that will tie back to your overarching argument. And so in that body of the op-ed, that's sort of where you give your own personal story, your own flavor that Alicia and Allison mentioned. Lastly, your most important points should be mentioned sooner rather than later. You shouldn't let your readers wait till the end for you to say what you really mean and what you want in terms, and this is especially important for recommendations. If you have a recommendation, you should provide it sooner rather than later, earlier in the op-ed than down at the bottom. If you pose a question in the op-ed, make sure that you answer it right away and not let your readers sort of sway and wait for the answer. Lastly, just in terms of the writing, shorter sentences, simple sentences, writing in your active voice, and then also achieving this tone of being conversational really resonates with people, so that you're not necessarily talking down to them, but you're really engaging in an honest conversation about something that's really important.
Okay, so for those of you who are on Zoom with us, I just dropped a bit.ly in the chat. If you can click on that, I'm going to ask you all to participate in a little exercise with me. So Allison mentioned this at the top of the call. Multiple perspectives are important. And so not even just, you know, at the heart of a bill, especially when it comes to harming immigrants, migrants, Black and brown people, we know that it's a values-based issue, and we know the harms of it. But oftentimes, what can move committee members and legislators are different perspectives. So thinking about what are the consequences when it comes to police and incarceration, what are the economic consequences? That's a big one. Is there anything public safety related that can be brought up in the bill? And so I'm going to talk through a previous bill that actually came through the Senate in 2019. It was SJR 18. It would have been a change to our Missouri Constitution. So it was a pretty big deal. This bill was known as Show Me Your Papers. So this was a bill that had passed previously in Arizona. And the same year that this bill was moving through Missouri, there were also other states that it was moving in, and I believe Florida and Texas may have been one, I forget, but it was a concern in 2019. So this bill emboldened law enforcement to check immigration status with everyone that they encountered, even if the encounter was not predicated because of something illegal. So it essentially gave law enforcement the power to racially profile people. And so let me transition to this Jamboard. Okay, so I have the Jamboard pulled up on my screen share. You all, if you can please pull it up too. I'm going to talk you through some of the issues with this bill, and I'm going to ask you to so if you, on the left side here, you can have add a sticky note. This is a sticky, and then you save it, and then it is on our Jamboard. So you see that there, and then you can edit it or delete it. I'm going to delete that. So as I talk through the different pieces of this bill, I invite you all to add to this Jamboard what could be your perspective that you bring to this this hearing. And as a reminder, when we are giving testimony, we like to have like a clear, concise message. So it may not be that values-based, it might be something else. And it is important to have multiple perspectives. So keep that in mind as you're dropping ideas and perspectives into this Jamboard. So within SJR 18, one of the issues was at the root of it, right? At the root of this bill, it dehumanized Black and brown people and equated immigration with criminalization. Another issue was policing and incarceration. So if police are obligated to prioritize immigration status checks, those who fear endangering themselves or others would not trust law enforcement to keep them safe. Additionally, this bill would, as I mentioned, lead to racial profiling, further harming Black and brown people. It was going to lead to unnecessary incarceration. This bill, because of that, was also going to create a lack of trust. You know, many people would have avoided reporting crimes. They wouldn't have called the police in emergencies. They wouldn't have acted as witnesses. This would have made it difficult for Missouri law enforcement officials to do their jobs because it was going to endanger Missourians, and people would be aware of that. Another major issue that this bill brought up were the state legal expenses. So that bill that I mentioned in Arizona was actually SB 1070. It was challenged by institutions like the ACLU. And so this bill was put into a legal battle. And the state of Arizona, it cost the state of Arizona $1.4 million in legal fees. Another part of this bill too was the economic damage. In 2014, undocumented immigrants paid Missouri 48.9 million in state and local taxes. Deportation and fear-based moving would mean losing this economic contribution. Missouri could also predict a decrease in sales tax revenue and an increase in unemployment. Something that we saw in Arizona because of this bill was that they lost money in tourism because people weren't going to a state where they were worried that they would be racially profiled. So these are the different pieces of the bill. And as we can see here on the Jamboard, lots of perspectives to bring into the conversation. Experience at the border of migrants not being criminals. Police are not trained to enforce immigration laws. My experience with police in my small hometown, safe because of trust. Enforcing this law makes Missouri look more out of step nationally. Absolutely. Police are wasting their time with criminals and not enough time engaging in the community and building and strengthening relationships. Correct. What if a person doesn't have their documents on them and then they are being asked to present this document? One thing I don't see on here that is really important and something that moves legislators often is that economic piece. So, you know, what is this going to cost Missouri? What will it actually cost Missouri in legal fees? And what would it cost Missouri in losing money from potentially tourism, from people leaving Missouri because of the fear of what our state would turn into? So it is incredibly important to bring in all of these perspectives when you are discussing the issues within a bill, because oftentimes there are many issues within this bill and it's not just values-based, even though that is at the heart of what is moving us and calling us to give this testimony. So often toward the end of this training, I'm going to list some organizations for you to follow, organizations that are within our coalition space with immigrant and migrant justice. And one great way to stay up to date, to know when bills are moving, to know when there's a call to action for you to go testify, is to follow these organizations on social media, sign up for their email blasts, stay connected, because oftentimes they will tell you when it's time to show up at the Capitol virtually or in person to give testimony. And then when you're usually in that space, there might be a sign-up list, and that is a really great way to coordinate testimony. So we can all strategically bring different perspectives into the conversation. So before I pass it off to Allison to open it up for questions. So if you have any questions, if you're watching on Facebook or if you're in Zoom, start thinking of those, drop them in the chat so we can get ready. I'm going to share a couple of resources with you. So I mentioned organizations to follow, absolutely. But if you want to track your own bills, you can do so on fastdemocracy.com. So you see the URL here, fastdemocracy.com/my-tracked-topics. You can do more than immigration. This webinar specifically is focused on immigration, but these tips, these tools, these resources, they can be taken into any issue, and fastdemocracy.com is great. You can actually track issues based on, you can track bills based on issues. So reproductive justice, racial justice, LGBTQ+, immigration, there's all kinds, voting, healthcare. You can sign up and track them there. So I mentioned we have a statewide immigration coalition. One of our partners, IFCLA, is currently going through an Immigration 101 course. And so as you see here, it's every Thursday in March from 2 to 3 p.m. There's actually one today that happened. So then there will be one next Thursday, and I've dropped the URL here. If you signed up for this event, you will get a follow-up email, and I'll be sending you all these links so you can sign up for anything that we might have coming up and anything that our coalition partners have coming up. So I mentioned our coalition. So this is our coalition. We are a statewide coalition working on immigrant and migrant justice. And as you see here, ACLU of Missouri, Advocates for Immigrant Rights and Reconciliation, Amnesty International Missouri, Bilingual International Assistance Services, Casa de Salud, UMSL Community Innovation and Action Center, Interfaith Community on Latin America, International Institute of St. Louis, Jewish Community Relations Council, Kansas Missouri Dream Alliance, LifeWise STL, Missouri Faith Voices, St. Louis University Center for Service and Community Engagement, St. Francis Community Services, St. Louis Scholarship Foundation. So we are a coalition. As you can see here, we're a mixture of advocacy groups, direct service providers, different university institutions, different community groups. And so follow all of us. Follow us on social media, sign up for our email blasts. We do a really great job of coordinating our efforts when it comes to any type of movement on bills at the state level. And so besides doing your own research or hearing from the coalition about upcoming bills, I'm going to give you 2 more resources. So, apologies. There are 2 chambers in the House, right? There is the House of Representatives and the Senate. And there are opportunities to testify in both chambers when bills are moving through. So one is the House. So you see here the URL, house.mo.gov/all-hearings. And so this is essentially a calendar on the upcoming hearings. So this is the House. And the Senate, they have different websites. Both the House and the Senate have their own website. You see here, senate.mo.gov/hearing schedule. This is also another calendar, so you can see what committee hearings are coming up. Some of our coalition members are actually currently engaging in a campaign because the Missouri legislature and Capitol building is not accessible, considering that we are still in a pandemic. So there is a campaign demanding really, that the Capitol bring in actual COVID policies and precautions and making hearings virtually accessible. Right now, let me go ahead and stop my screen share. So right now, some committees are offering virtual testimony, but honestly, that's at the discretion of the chair and it's not happening enough. And so this campaign is calling on a more robust approach to make sure that the Capitol is accessible for folks to go and testify either virtually or in person with actual precautions in place. So that is it for some next steps and resources. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. I'm going to pass it off to Allison. Allison's going to facilitate our Q&A. Also, we're kind of a small group in the Zoom room. If you just want to come off mute, you can ask your question too.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions in the Facebook or in the chat, so giving everyone a little bit of extra time, I actually had a question to start off. Alicia, I love how you mentioned earlier about like the nervousness piece and possibly practicing. So I'm wondering if you, or even Adriano, if you have anything to add to this, just any more other tips and tricks that maybe folks could apply if they're testifying tomorrow. How could they prepare, or even how to prepare someone who's new, never done this before?
Yeah, I think my biggest suggestion is to write down your thoughts, like actually edit it. We'll send out the slides, but Adriano went through the steps of preparing your statement, actually having a closing, introducing yourself, going through the different points and then closing out, thanking the committee, and practicing it. And yeah, if there's anything in your testimony as you're trying to say it out loud that is like catching you or tripping you up, change it, change it so that however you're speaking your truth is comfortable for you and that you feel confident when you're saying it. Because if there's a sentence that I just stumble through and I cannot get out there, I'm going to go into that hearing so nervous because I know like it's going to happen. I'm going to trip on this and like, I'm going to be embarrassed, or it's going to make me even more nervous.
Yeah, it's a great point. I was going to say the same thing in terms of like when you rehearse it and there's just one sentence that just doesn't feel right, or you just keep on tripping on it. It's usually an indicator that it's not necessarily like, you. And so, finding your voice and finding what's comfortable for you, that's sort of where your energy is going to be when you get up there. I actually like asking people if I could just talk through it in front of them and getting their feedback. I like to do that, especially if I get really nervous with the Q&A and getting like cross-examined. I do not like it. I just don't think that way. But I like to try to get some friends who I know are critical but constructive to just sort of feed me some questions so that I can rehearse at least my composure and what I say. But to that, you always have what's important about writing stuff down is you'll always have your statement to ground you, and that's what you use to answer these questions. So it's really important to have with you.
Couple questions. One is just a basic, simple one, but will these slides be shared? And if so, where? I'll pause and then ask the other ones.
Absolutely. So if you registered, I will email these out to you sometime within the next couple of days. And if you are watching this on the Facebook stream, I can be sure to post a link to the slides sometime in the future. So hopefully when you're watching this, like within the next couple of days, or you will have already seen this in the comments.
Awesome, thank you. And then the other is, and you may have talked about this already because I hopped on a little late, but with the way testifying in committee hearings work, it's pretty last minute. Do you suggest like preparing something in advance? And if so, what immigration topics would be useful to prepare in advance? I'm just thinking like if I hear like, hey, we need people to testify tomorrow, usually personally, I'm just like, oh, well, I can't be ready for that. So kind of thinking timeline.
That is a great question, Jessica. Thank you. A common theme that we see, not even just in Missouri, but like nationwide, is the equating immigrants with criminals and criminalization. That might look like policing, that might look like harsher anti-sanctuary laws. So something regarding like criminalization and incarceration could be helpful. Also, there's always an opportunity, because we are unfortunately one of the states that does not, one of the few states that does not offer in-state tuition to DACA recipients. So there can always be potential for testimony regarding bills when it comes to the in-state tuition, whether it's a budget hearing or an actual bill that might be moving through the chamber. And Adriana or Allison, if there's anything you'd like to add to that.
Actually, one thing I would add to the timeline aspect, something you could do to get ahead of that is actually talk to folks ahead of time about the possibility of testifying. I know that's something Alicia and I have done with Privacy Watch. We knew a bill was coming up. We didn't know when, but we knew they're going to have a hearing. There will be testimonies. We need to get some folks lined up ready to do that. So then that way, if it is like it's happening tomorrow, hopefully when we're letting them know that it's tomorrow, that's not the first time that we're asking them to testify.
Yes, very good point. You will all get the slides, and in the slides listed out are our coalition members. So like I said, I can't say this enough. Follow us, follow them on social media, sign up for their emails, because oftentimes you will get a sense of bill movement whether it's to call your legislator to let them know that you do or don't want them to vote on yes or no on this. And then you'll start to get indications on, when a committee hearing is coming up. As Jessica mentioned, it can sometimes be, oh, this is happening tomorrow. We've got to get moving. So the earlier you engage during session, the better. And session in Missouri, just in case you don't know, usually starts in early January and ends in May, but there can be special session that can last who knows when. But just being engaged with a lot of these organizations will help you better understand the legislative process and how bills are moving too. So I think that's it for questions. So I think we're wrapping up, y'all. Thank you, those who joined us on the Zoom call. Thank you for those who are watching on the stream. Allison or Adriano, is there anything you'd like to share before we close out?
Allison, you got anything?
I'll just reiterate, thank you so much again for attending. Hope this was useful and that you learned a lot. And if any questions come to you tomorrow, later on this evening, you're always welcome to reach out to, I believe, Alicia at the ACLU, who is hosting this tonight with those questions.
Yeah, I was going to say, in response to Jessica's comment, this roundtable and the people who meet in it and around it are really good indicators of what's happening in Missouri. And so I'm just grateful to be part of that and also to follow them on social media to give me an idea of what's happening in our state. And so I want to thank Alicia for inviting me. Thanks for Allison for being on this panel. I enjoyed it and hope we can do this again.
Absolutely. And thank you, Allison and Adriano again. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a good night, y'all.
Take care.
Thank you.